Good. Thank you, Mr. Robin. Volume 1, Number 1 of WQED's Weekly. We'll be back in just a moment.
How do you feel about Pittsburgh being ranked so low?
Well, I think Pittsburgh's a great city, man. I don't know why they're rated so low. Can't understand it.
Well, I don't know. I just saw Seattle, which I love, and that was first. I don't know how Pittsburgh compared with it. What was Pittsburgh?
I think it's an exciting city, I'll put it that way.
So you don't agree with the survey?
Right, I don't.
I don't know. I believe it might be rated 31st because people aren't together here. I mean, they won't help one another do things. And like the Skybus situation is still not settled. So I think it was deserved, the low rating it got.
I don't know if it's that low, but it doesn't compare to San Francisco. Pollution's pretty heavy here.
Well, I don't think it should be. I think Pittsburgh is someplace special and should be rated about, the least 10.
I never gave it any thought. Sorry.
Well, at WQED's Weekly, we too are not very concerned about this rating. Harper's, after all, is a fine magazine, but like all the newspapers, you remember, that predicted that Dewey would be Truman, Harper's was, we think, a little hasty in their judgment. As surely as Truman beat Dewey, history will no doubt record that back in 1975, a prestigious magazine was all wet about Pittsburgh. Now, if you do have any doubts, just ask a Steelers fan. A city, we think, is only as good or as great as the people who live in it. And we think that we can prove that right now by introducing you to an old Pittsburgher named Leon Bibber. Mr. Bibber is 81, and he's found a unique answer to the meaning of life, a 100-ton steel-welded answer.
Some people spend their whole lives in search of something. Maybe it's the ultimate pizza. Maybe it's a message from God. Well, Leon Bibber's compulsion happens to be boats. So he spent his 81 years looking for the ultimate boat. One day, about 33 years ago, he realized that if his dream would ever come true, he would have to build that boat himself. So, that's exactly what he did.
If you had bought a boat, you could have been traveling around for the last 19 or so years.
Yes, but you wouldn't then not have had the fun of building the boat.
Has this...
Not only that, you know, there is one school of thought which believes it's more fun to build boats than it is to sail them.
You'd never guessed that such a dream took shape on the banks of the Allegheny River, and of all places inside an old coal barge. But that's where he built his boat. Bibber's dream was born as a kid growing up around shipbuilders and sailors along the coast of Maine. He went to college and studied marine architecture. He taught himself welding and carpentry. In fact, his whole life was aimed toward just one goal. In 1955, the year after his wife died, Bibber sold his home in Mount Lebanon and bought a barge. A work crew built walls and a roof on it, and then he built an apartment inside. This was his new home, his office, and his workshop until he finished. Bibber, the dreamer, said he'd be finished in 2 or 3 years, but it actually took Bibber, the pragmatist, 19 hard years of welding and torch cutting and grinding, working 8 hours a day, 7 days a week.
That is definitely not going to pull it full stroke. Okay, leave it right there. Well, we'll have to do it over again. We'll live and rest. We've had quite a number of very challenging problems, let us say. But that's all part of the building of a boat. You have to solve them day after day as you come to them.
This is it, his dream boat. And quite appropriately, he called it Achievement. It's 80 feet long and made of steel. It sleeps 6 in private staterooms. And there's a modern kitchen, a washer and dryer, and even a garage for his car beneath the rear deck. It's mostly the work of one man, but not entirely.
True, but we got to clear this.
Oh, yes, that's true.
All dreamers have their assistant dreamers, someone to be frustrated with, someone to laugh with, someone to break up the inevitable loneliness of a one-man crusade. Alexander Graham Bell had Watson. Leon Bibber has Jim Pelch.
We have a lot of fun, you know, plus we have our serious business, which has to be all the time, you know, when you're doing something as serious as this.
After all those years, Bibber was nearly ready to launch the boat. A crew removed half of the barge's roof, and Bibber cut it loose from its moorings. A towboat pushed it downriver to Neville Island, where Pittsburgh Des Moines Steel Company would use its big cranes to lift the boat out of the barge and set it down in the water. Then, for the first time, Bibber would see if his vision was true, or, if like the Titanic, another man's vision of the ultimate boat, this hunk of steel would just sink to the bottom of the Ohio River. Bibber got to the steel yard early on a cold winter morning, but there wasn't much left for him to do, except worry. By lunchtime, a small crowd gathered, some curious steel workers, and a few of Bibber's closest friends. Charles Smith is Bibber's age, so he could talk about some of the concerns other people were thinking, but just couldn't bring themselves to say.
That he had this fulfillment idea, particularly when you get older, that gives you something to live for, really. I'm telling you, you yourself will never know about it until you get old. And for him to, well, gosh, he's, you know, if he hadn't been doing this, he might have been dead 20 years ago. Really, this is true.
Finally, the time came.
Glad we got here in time.
Bibber's only daughter and son-in-law stood with him.
I think he's lifting now. Now, this is the moment of truth, whether or not she...
I christen the achievement.
The successful launch on that winter day closed one very long chapter in Leon Bibber's life, his search for the ultimate boat. What's next?
Late next fall, we will start down the Ohio River and the Mississippi River, across the Gulf of Mexico and around Key West, and up the Atlantic coast to Hampton, Virginia, where we will probably base. And I have no desire to cross the oceans. Not at my age, I'm not going to cross any oceans.
We feel that Leon Bibber is being overly modest, maybe, and that an ocean crossing would offer few, if any, roadblocks to this man who can obviously do anything he puts his mind to, given a little bit of time. So move over, Robert Fulton. Make room for Leon Bibber, 81 years young. Harper's Magazine, If Only You Had Known. Because Pittsburgh is not only full of men with great ideas, it's a haven for the memories and recollections of those whose great deeds have taken them out of Pittsburgh to make their mark on the rest of the world. Take Marty Allen, for example.
Is this the face of a former choir boy and a budding journalist? Or the face of Taylor Allderdice's most famous class clown? Actually, comedian Marty Allen was all of these when he was growing up in Squirrel Hill. He was known as Morton Alprin back then. His friends called him Morty. At home, he was quiet, even shy. His high school yearbook from 1940 says that he wanted to be a journalist. But there was another side to Morty, the class clown, the merry prankster, the wild dancer. Around school, he was a whirling dervish, always on, running here or there, making people laugh, dancing the jitterbug so well he was named the city champ. The choral director at Allderdice, Miss Steiner, used to call him a monkey on a stick. It was this side of him that won out.
Living across the street from the Taylor Allderdice High School, I think of a very wonderful and warm... hello there! We didn't plan that. Very warm school days, you know, growing up. My house right across the street from the school, and what was really funny was that I used to look out of my bedroom window and I'd say, well, I got a few more minutes, and without realizing it, it would almost be time for the bell to ring. I'd be running across the street, and I was always late. It seemed I was always late. Of course, at 3 o'clock, the school let out, and then we'd all run over here and be sitting on the porch and singing and dancing and just having really good fun, you know.
They tore your house down.
Yeah, they made apartments out of it. They could at least put a plaque up there that says, hello there, lived here.
Do you remember any of your famous pranks?
Putting white mice in the locker, and when the bell rang and the kids would run between lockers, usually the girls, because a friend of mine who's now a big doctor in the city, he had these white mice, and I would take them, we'd put them in the lockers, and the girls would reach for their books. I think that was quite a wild thing.
Any of the faces look familiar to you?
Well, the faces are actually the faces of kids that you might say are the same faces, only just a few years apart, you know. It's almost the same thing. I guess the kids almost always look about the same. Kids don't change, really. Maybe the hairstyles.
Certainly, with respect to hair, the crop on Marty Allen's head makes him somewhat of an authority. Whether he's an authority on kids, we're not so sure, because kids do change. They grow, and they grow old. For some of our senior citizens, that turns out to be not so pleasant a prospect. And that's something we're going to be looking at on the next edition of WQED's Weekly, Boarding Homes for the Elderly. It's a story I personally didn't know existed in Western Pennsylvania or anywhere else for that matter. And if my reactions were typical, I'd suggest you tune in next week. Also coming up on next week's edition, the newest way to pack 'em in on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock. Advertising for a congregation. And in weeks to come, more on the people and institutions that make Western Pennsylvania the special place we all know it really is. This was Volume 1, Number 1 of WQED's Weekly. I'm Frank Gardner. Good evening.
WQED's Weekly was made possible in part by grants from the Hillman Foundation, the Pennsylvania Public Television Network, and by your local contributions.